Every empire hides its greatest invention behind a lie that sounds like order. And for America, that invention was money, not the shining metal pulled from the earth, but the idea that paper could replace it, that belief could become the raw material of wealth. The system's brilliance did not lie in vaults or coins, but in language itself, words printed with authority, signatures turned into value, laws that transformed imagination into obligation. It was not greed that made it powerful, but grammar, the subtle conviction that if a thing could be written, it could be owned. A promise signed by one man could become a debt carried by millions. And somewhere between trust and necessity, illusion hardened into infrastructure. Generations later, no one would remember the first deception, only the comfort of its stability, the way a lie repeated long enough begins to sound like truth, especially when it pays the bills. The seed of that ruthless faith was sown far before America was born. In 1694, the Bank of England was created not to store treasure, but to manufacture it. A group of private lenders offered a king the lifeline of credit to wage his wars, and in return they gained the right to issue paper notes. These notes were promises, not possessions, claims on wealth that did not yet exist, written in ink and believed in full. The alchemy worked. People accepted paper as gold because it bore the emblem of authority. Confidence became collateral. This was the first transmutation of modern power, the conversion of faith into finance. When the 13 colonies finally broke from Britain, they rebelled against its crown but not its economic magic. The blueprint of illusion crossed the ocean with them. After independence, America was rich in land but poor in species. The war had drained its treasury, and the new nation found itself with an abundance of promises and a shortage of coins. Alexander Hamilton, a man who admired the British model as much as he feared chaos, offered a solution to bind belief into a system. In 1791, he established the first Bank of the United States, a curious creature, part government, part private entity, authorized to issue notes against federal debt. Gold anchored the image, but the image soon outweighed the anchor. For the first time, the young republic was powered not by what it had, but by what it could convince others it possessed. As decades passed, this logic spread like wildfire. Banks sprouted in every city, each printing its own currency, each issuing more promises than reserves. Prosperity seemed infinite, until reality arrived to collect its dues. The Panic of 1819, then 1837, then 1857, each collapse was a moment when the nation's faith cracked, revealing that the paper world rested on air. Yet Americans learned the wrong lesson. Instead of rejecting illusion, they tried to perfect it. The obsession was no longer with possession, but with expansion, how far belief could stretch before it snapped. Railroads were built with borrowed money, factories financed with future profits, cities planned on the assumption that the future would always deliver. The illusion became the operating system of ambition itself. By the time Civil War tore the country apart, the government had no choice but to join the conjuring. In 1862, it printed greenbacks, paper money unbacked by gold to pay soldiers and suppliers. What had begun as a trick of private bankers became an act of national faith. The republic that once measured virtue in hard work now measured survival in soft currency. The greenback saved the Union but also confirmed its dependence on belief. America could now create wealth by decree, and once a nation learns that, it never unlearns it. Beneath these mechanics of finance pulsed a philosophy deeper than arithmetic. The old world saw money as substance, the new world saw it as a possibility. America's genius was not invention but reinvention, the conviction that reality could be edited if enough people agreed on the new draft. The Enlightenment had replaced divine authority with human reason. America replaced reason with confidence. The result was a culture that equated optimism with truth. Debt was no longer a failure, it was a bet on the future. Every loan became an act of faith in progress. The system rewarded imagination and punished doubt. It turned belief itself into a commodity. Picture the scene: a quiet office in Philadelphia, candlelight trembling on brass scales and open ledgers. A clerk signs his name on a note worth more than the gold beneath his desk. The paper glides across the table, featherlight yet heavy with consequence. Outside, the city hums, the whir of presses, the hammering of ships, the whisper of ambition. No one notices that the sound of metal has faded, replaced by the rustle of paper. The world has changed its heartbeat. The economy no longer weighs its worth in ounces but in faith. By the end of the 19th century, the transformation was complete. Gold still slept in vaults, but its meaning had been inverted. It no longer gave paper value. Paper gave gold purpose. The illusion had matured into a moral code, a silent agreement that trust was the ultimate resource. Americans no longer asked what backed their money, they simply believed that something must. The lie had become a law, and the law had become tradition. The pen had conquered the mine, the ledger had outlived the coin. What began as a convenient deception became the foundation of the world's most powerful economy, a system built on belief, refined by law, and sanctified by habit. And long after its architects were gone, their invention endured, quietly ruling a nation that mistook confidence for truth, and the ripple continues. Power, once discovered, never disappears. It simply changes its signature. After a century of paper promises and private banks teetering on faith, America stood on the edge of the 20th century, searching not for honesty, but for permanence. The old chaos of panics and collapses had exposed a dangerous truth. The illusion of money could only survive if it was organized, legalized, and defended by the very government it deceived. The Panic of 1907 was the breaking point, a financial seizure so violent that markets froze, banks failed, and the public watched in terror as prosperity revealed its emptiness. Out of that fear, a familiar remedy emerged. Create an institution powerful enough to stabilize the illusion. Stability, after all, is the most persuasive mask a lie can wear. In 1910, a handful of the country's wealthiest financiers boarded a private train bound for a small island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. It sounded innocent enough, a retreat for aristocrats and tycoons, yet history would remember it as the birthplace of the modern American money machine. There, under the dim glow of oil lamps, they drafted a blueprint that would quietly transform private influence into public authority. The plan was simple in genius and sinister in symmetry. Centralize the creation of credit under one institution, wrap it in patriotic language, and call it a system. 3 years later, on December 23, 1913, while most of Congress had left for the holidays, President Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The illusion that once needed belief now had legislation. A private network of banks was reborn as a national guardian of stability, a word that would soon mean control. From that moment, America's money ceased to be merely a medium of exchange, it became a mechanism of obedience. The Federal Reserve could issue currency not limited by gold, but by policy, not by what existed, but by what could be managed. For the first time, money creation was no longer a natural consequence of trade or scarcity, it was a decision, calculated and political. Every note carried the quiet watermark of discretion. In the hands of technocrats, trust became an instrument, debt a design, and inflation a hidden tax that needed no approval. The brilliance of the system lay in its invisibility. Few citizens understood it, yet all depended on it, and those who did understand it had no reason to explain. World War I arrived just in time to baptize the new creation. The same paper that once financed merchants now financed armies. Gold was hoarded, melted, and forgotten as nations discovered that war could be paid for with promises. The printing press replaced the mint, inflation replaced taxation. In the 1920s, America emerged victorious, rich on paper, and confident that prosperity had been engineered at last. Skyscrapers climbed higher, speculation soared, and the dollar became a symbol of unstoppable faith. Yet faith by nature is fragile. In 1929 the illusion collapsed again, and the Great Depression revealed what the Roaring Decade had concealed, that the money system was no longer an economy, it was a theater of leverage, and the actors had forgotten they were performing. President Roosevelt's response in 1933 did not end the scam, it perfected it. Declaring a national emergency, he closed the banks, confiscated citizens' gold, and outlawed private ownership of the metal that once defined value. Americans surrendered their coins for paper and called it recovery. The state had learned the oldest trick of power: if you can't trust the illusion, criminalize the alternative. Gold vanished from circulation, and the public adapted, grateful simply to survive. The New Deal was not just social policy, it was psychological conditioning. It taught a generation to equate government management with salvation, to see inflation as growth, and to forget that money was ever meant to be scarce. As the Second World War erupted, the United States emerged as creditor to the world, armed not only with armies, but with the printing press that paid for them. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the dollar was crowned the world's reserve currency, redeemable in gold, yet controlled entirely by those who printed it. The arrangement was elegant, illusion dressed as order, empire disguised as agreement. Every nation that held dollars became a silent participant in the same scam, trading tangible wealth for symbolic trust. The machine that began in secrecy now spanned oceans. America no longer borrowed confidence, it exported it. Yet beneath the triumph ran the same moral fault line: value without virtue, stability without substance. The Federal Reserve had become a priesthood of modern finance, interpreting the mysteries of inflation and interest rates like sacred texts. Its language grew dense, its purpose abstract, its authority absolute. The public, numbed by complexity, mistook obscurity for expertise. They did not see that the scam had evolved beyond deception. It no longer needed secrecy, it survived on indifference. As long as life continued, as long as wages were paid and shelves were stocked, no one asked what stood behind the curtain. By mid-century, the American system had perfected the art of silent extraction. Through controlled inflation, every printed dollar quietly diluted the last, transferring wealth from labor to credit, from citizen to state, from the visible to the invisible. The same government that had outlawed gold now owned the power once reserved for kings, to create money from nothing and charge interest on the miracle. The illusion had become institutional, and the institution had become sacred. And when a belief is enforced by law, it no longer feels like belief, it feels like truth. Thus the legal scam that began on an island of secrecy became the cornerstone of modern civilization. Generations grew up never questioning why their money lost value, why debt grew faster than wages, why the system always seemed to demand faith while rewarding control. The answer was simple and terrifying, because it was designed that way. The trick was no longer hidden, it was hereditary. And every note that changed hands carried the quiet confession of its creation, that power, once written into law, never ends. It merely learns to smile. By the middle of the 20th century, America no longer asked whether its money was real. The world simply behaved as though it were. The dollar had become a kind of gravity, an invisible force that bent every other currency toward it, and nations revolved obediently around its pull. The illusion, once local and fragile, had matured into an architecture of global dependence. When the Second World War ended, gold was locked in Fort Knox, but power lived in Washington, printed by decree and distributed through faith. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 crowned the United States as the keeper of the world's reserves, its paper redeemable for metal, its promise redeemable for trust. Yet within that promise hid a quiet contradiction. If the entire planet demanded gold, the vaults would empty overnight. The foundation of global stability rested on the hope that no one would ever ask to see it. In 1971, the question finally arrived. Foreign governments, uneasy with America's endless spending on wars and welfare, began to convert their paper for gold. The outflow became a run, and President Nixon, in a televised announcement calm as arithmetic, declared the dollar no longer tied to the metal that had once defined civilization. The world watched the anchor cut loose, and instead of sinking, the ship kept sailing. For the first time in human history, money was completely imaginary, its value measured only by decree and memory. Economists called it a new era. Historians would later call it what it was: the moment illusion became permanent. The printing press was no longer a tool of crisis but a policy of prosperity. The trick had gone global, and no one wanted it undone. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the American dream merged seamlessly with the dollar's dominion. Credit cards replaced savings, deficits replaced discipline, and consumption replaced production. Debt was no longer a symptom of excess, it was the engine of growth. Politicians discovered that promises could be paid with paper and consequences delayed with interest. Corporations learned that profits could be engineered from speculation rather than labor. The line between finance and governance blurred until markets dictated policy and policy served markets. Wall Street became the new capital, and the American household its quiet subsidiary. Every mortgage, every bond, every loan was a small act of worship to the same invisible god, compound interest. Meanwhile, technology turned that god omnipresent. Computers replaced clerks, algorithms replaced judgment, and digits replaced dollars. Value no longer passed hand to hand, but flickered across screens in fractions of a second. The human face of money disappeared. The same logic that once printed paper, now printed code. A trade executed in New York could erase a pension in Manila before breakfast. The system had achieved what its founders on Jekyll Island could only imagine: self-replication. It no longer required belief from citizens, it programmed belief into the machinery itself. Convenience became dependence, data became collateral. The network was the new mint, and sped up the new sovereignty. Yet every perfection hides a weakness. As money dematerialized, so did accountability. Inflation, that old silent thief, returned wearing digital clothes. The cost of living rose while wages stagnated, and the wealth that credit once promised concentrated in the hands of those who designed the code. A century earlier, the banker's pen had created paper promises. Now the programmer's algorithm created invisible chains. Central banks called it liquidity, investors called it innovation, and the public called it progress. But beneath the language, the pattern remained unchanged. Value conjured from nothing, risk transferred downward, and the illusion protected by complexity. The scam no longer needed secrecy. It survived on exhaustion. Then came the crises that exposed the machinery again. The oil shocks of the 1970s, the savings and loan collapse, the dot-com burst, the crash of 2008, the pandemic stimulus of 2020. Each disaster followed the same choreography: panic, printing, recovery, amnesia. Every rescue made the system larger, the lie more sophisticated, and the dependence more complete. When trillions could appear overnight to save markets but not to save people, the illusion revealed its hierarchy. The promise of equality had become the arithmetic of privilege, and yet each time, the world returned to the same belief, that money, though untethered, inflated and abstract, would always hold. The alternative was unthinkable. In the 21st century, the trick entered its final form: abstraction, masquerading as progress. Digital currencies, central bank wallets, algorithmic coins, all new names for the same faith. The citizen became a data point inside the balance sheet of the state, monitored, measured, managed. Privacy dissolved, replaced by efficiency. Autonomy traded for convenience. The economy no longer needed participation, only compliance. Control had become the new currency. Every transaction, every click, every digit reaffirmed the same ancient contract, that power could be infinite if people stopped asking where it came from. And still, the illusion holds. The skyscrapers glow, markets hum, screens pulse with green numbers promising growth. The old gold lies forgotten, the paper decays, but the belief endures, reborn in circuits, baptized in light. America's money system, once a clever invention of bankers and politicians, has become something larger than both, a living myth, maintained not by truth but by repetition. It runs through nations, through homes, through thoughts, a river of symbols that buys obedience and sells hope. But every illusion, no matter how intricate, carries the seed of its collapse. History is patient. It waits for confidence to tire. The same faith that built the empire will one day question itself, and when it does, the world will remember that value was never printed, only believed. Until that reckoning arrives, the system continues, smooth, digital, and divine in its precision, an empire of code sustained by collective amnesia, a masterpiece of control disguised as progress. And somewhere beneath the hum of servers and the glow of numbers, the faint echo of an old deception still whispers through the circuitry, the same trick, refined by time, commanding a world too afraid to stop believing, and the ripple continues. If this story resonated with you, let it travel further. Like, share, and subscribe to keep the ripple alive.